claim in today's world that perception increasingly is more important than reality. But is it true? If there's one person who knows more about this topic than anyone, it would be today's guest who, through his research and writing, made the world become aware of that we as humans believe in false statements. And if we do that, we're also more likely to believe in arguments supporting those. It's called confirmation bias, a term which the world now is very familiar with. And I guess that's the reason why we have our guest on board today. The fact is that we are all impacted by it. If you believe you're an exception, then it's time to watch The Eminem Show. Hey everyone, welcome to all the viewers across the world, our World Business Forum audience, and all our Chief Executive Magazine readers. I'm Martin Lindstrom, your co-host, along with my dear friend and the world's #1 leadership coach, Marshall Goldsmith. Marshall is a member of the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame and has written some of the most iconic books out there, like What Got You Here Won't Get You There and Mojo, How to Get It. But beside all those fancy credentials, more importantly than anything, Marshall is an amazing human being. Marshall, as always, I'm so delighted that you are standing up against me and giving us this opportunity to work together. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Let me briefly introduce my wonderful friend, Martin Lindstrom, who is the world's most interesting person I've ever met, has had a fascinating life. He was in Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world, and also a member of Thinkers 50, and just has published some great books like Biology, The Ministry of Common Sense. And to me, more important than that, is a great spirit toward life, and also tries to help people. Does a ton of volunteer work, is always willing to pitch in, help anybody that needs help. So really honored to be working with you, Martin. And we always have fun.
Yeah, we certainly do. Thank you so much. And you make me blush every time. Listen, everyone out there, if you like this show or you want to just shout out where you're from, just drop us a note. And by the way, don't forget to press the like or the follow button, which is just underneath the screen. Now, some years ago, from my book, Biology, Buyology, we scanned more than 2,000 smokers' brains using fMRI. Our objective was to understand the impact health warnings on the cigarette packs have on us. Well, guess what we learned? To everyone's surprise, we discovered that the health warnings on cigarette packs has the complete reverse effect. They, in fact, encourage smokers to smoke more, not less. As a result, most governments across the world actually changed the rule, and with that, completely changed the way health warnings today are displayed on cigarette packs worldwide. Now, what I came to discover is how susceptible we are to everything, like the 2008 study proving, or at least indicating, that people who are unknowingly exposed for an Apple logo actually become more creative. Or the study claims that people exposed to a Nike logo becomes more energetic. Now, can you believe it? I guess our workplace perhaps is no exception. Now, Marshall, this is a controversial and it's a super fascinating topic. Can you tell all our viewers more about our first guest?
Our first guest is, I'm a big fan of our first guest. I've only read 2 of his books, but I'm a big fan of the 2 I've read. Our first guest seems like a really nice guy, a professor, a researcher. He's done some amazing work in the field of decision-making, behavioral economics. He did win the Nobel Prize for his work, which, put it in context, incredibly unusual, because most people who won the Nobel Prize in that field were from a very different field, kind of to say the least. So a very different person, and just seemed like a good spirit toward life. And also my daughter Kelly is a professor at Vanderbilt, said to say hi. She's a wonderful fan of yours. She went to Yale with one of your students. So very honored to have Daniel Kahneman here. And Daniel, thank you for joining us. Question number 1. And as I told you, that book Noise really helped me understand something that's taken me 70 years to figure out. I'm going to use the term non-rational. What are some of the non-rational factors that influence our decision-making in life that we often, and you can't cover them all because the book is a whole book about it, but what are some of the big ones that maybe we're unaware of? Oh, and then one other one, if you can briefly talk about that noise audit concept, because I love that idea.
You're inviting me to talk for a long time, so
give us the highlights.
If I had to, there is a long catalog of problems with human cognition. I mean, the main thing to remember probably is that we are much less reasonable than we think we are, and that many of the opinions that we have, we believe we have them for a reason, but in fact, the real causes for our beliefs are very different from those we have, from those we think we have. That a great deal of time when we think we have reached a reasoned conclusion, it comes from somewhere else. It can come from emotions, or it can simply come from a shortcut in the way that we think. So I want the picture to be sort of balanced. I don't really like the word irrational, and many people believe that this is what I'm engaged in. I think the word non-rational is much better. Now, actually, I don't like the word rational either. And the reason I don't is that I view the word rational as a technical term. And rational means completely logical. And it means that all your beliefs and all your preferences are internally consistent. And this is completely impossible. It's a non-starter for people with a finite mind. So rationality is an ideal, and it's unachievable as an ideal. Reasonableness, that's what we should be striving for. We should strive to be reasonable, and people are a lot closer to being reasonable than they are to being rational, but a lot of the time they're not very reasonable either. So that's a more balanced way of describing, I think, what I've been into. A big question that I've been concerned with is intuition, that many people are very curious about that term, and when can you trust intuition? And there are interesting situations. Intuitions is marvelous, but it's also very flawed. And the problem, and the big problem, is that as an individual, I have intuitions. That is, I have strong beliefs about various things that I hold with a lot of confidence. And I really am not a good judge of when my intuitions are true and when they're false, when they can be trusted and when they cannot be trusted. So learning how to critique your own intuitions and those of others, that's an interesting topic. I won't elaborate on it now because I don't know if that's what you want me to do. But those are some of the important points that that I have been studying.
Daniel, you introduced some. You first, Marshall.
Yeah, how about the noise audit? I just love the concept of the noise audit, and that's something anybody can use.
Well, the concept of a noise audit, we wrote a book called Noise, a Flaw in Human Judgment. And we wrote that book because people are focused on bias as the main source of error. And indeed, the word bias and the word error have become almost synonymous in recent decades. But it turns out that noise, just plain variability, randomness in judgment, is a very important source of errors for organizations. And people are largely unaware of it. So I'll tell you a story from the beginning of our work, how our work on noise began. I was consulting with an insurance company and working, among others, say, with underwriters. And the idea I had was, let's present the same problem to underwriters, and it's a problem that they deal like the ones that they deal with on their job every day, a realistic problem with a complicated risk. and let them put a dollar value on it, which is their job every day. And I asked executives, so clearly you don't expect two underwriters to come to exactly the same dollar number. I mean, we know this is a judgment problem, and on matters of judgment, we know that reasonable people can disagree a little, not too much. The question is, how much disagreement should we expect? So I asked the executives, if you take two underwriters at random and you look at their dollar value, and you take the average and the difference, by what percentage do you expect them to differ? What looks like a reasonable number? Now, everyone in the audience has a number in their head, and I know what that number is for the majority of people who listen. It's 10%. 10% looks like a reasonable difference. It's tolerable. You can live with that. But in fact, when we actually measured how much discrepancy there was between two underwriters, two random underwriters, the difference was 50%, 5 times more than people expected. And that came as a complete surprise to the organization. And that's where we wrote the book, basically, because wherever there is judgment, there is noise. Everybody knows that. But there is much more noise than you think. That's what we learned from that experiment. And a noise audit is simply an experiment like the one I described, where you have many people in the organization whom you expect, they all speak for the organization. They all make decisions on behalf of the organization. You would expect the organization speaks through them. You know, it makes proposal, it accepts offers. So you would expect the organization to speak in one voice, but actually it doesn't. There is a lottery depending on who you interact with, which underwriter. There is a lottery depending on which judge. If you're a defendant, which judge is going to hear your case? That's noise, and a noise audit is a way to measure noise. And that's what we did in that insurance company.
Fascinating stuff, Daniel. I'm going to take you on a detour here for a second, because there's one question which is super close to me, and I'm curious to hear what your response is. I would claim that you and I are influenced by a lot of signals every day, and a lot of the decisions we make, we may not make consciously, we make it subconsciously. And we sort of kind of don't know how impacted we are by the surroundings. And not only to tell you this whole issue with equality and race issues and stuff like that, also somehow are categorizing people in our mind. I'm going to play a little video with you. It's a bit controversial, but I want to play it for you first to hear if there's something to what this research study is claiming, or if you feel, you know what, this is completely off track. So let's just play this video for a second, and then just let's talk about what your view is about it.
Images and even words, slipping thoughts and feelings into our subconscious is one thing. But what is more worrying is how those thoughts and feelings can then change our behavior. Today, one of John Barger's PhD students is running an experiment to investigate the priming effects of temperature.
What we do in our experiment, we very briefly expose people to a warm or cold substance. And what we expect to happen is that simple experience with a warm substance or a cold substance will prime people to sort of activate these feelings of warmth and comfort and the things that we've learned about since we were very young. And when we have those things in mind, those things we know will color people's judgments and decisions and their behaviors as well.
Volunteers for the experiment are asked to hold a warm cup of coffee as they are met by Lawrence. They have been primed with heat. The purpose of the experiment is to record participants' judgments about Lawrence's colleague, Randy.
How was your break? It was awesome.
It was good until I got stranded in Florida because of the snowstorm in New York on Friday, so I got stranded.
The theory is that the hot drink will somehow elicit positive feelings towards Randy, even several minutes after experiencing the warmth of the cup. And here's the killer question. Would you give Randy a permanent job?
Based on your brief interaction with Randy, or would you hire him as project manager?
He seemed like a generally friendly guy.
So yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, why not?
Sure. Yes. Yes.
Saying warm and friendly things about a stranger might just be the normal polite response. Time to cool things down.
Can you hold this for a second? Can you hold this for a second? Sure. Can you spell this for a second?
Except for the temperature of the drink. Identical conditions. The same conversation with Randy.
How was your break? You glad to be back?
Not really.
And 6 minutes later, the same questions from Lawrence.
Based on your brief interaction with him, would you recommend him, or would you hire Randy as project manager?
As a leader? I'm not sure.
Based on the brief interaction? No.
Maybe not from the impression that I got.
The experiment shows, remarkably, that a brief encounter with a beverage could see you either hired or fired. It's a powerful effect, and one that might have worrying applications.
Now, this is a very black and white case, I know, and I'm not asking you to say if this is correct or not, but I question to you, Daniel, is how influenced are we by signals around us where we're not really thinking about it? And I'm asking about that in the context of the workplace, where there's so many signals and so many issues which are being raised right now. Is this something which really is a prominent part of how we behave?
Well, I have changed my mind on this particular problem. So 10 years ago, I wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, in which I had a whole chapter. I didn't have this particular study, but I had a whole chapter of studies of that kind. And I thought they were wonderful and very exciting. The problem is that 10 years later, there has been a lot of research raising questions about this whole family of studies, including the warm-cold study. And there probably are effects, but the effects are small. When you when you look at this film, you have the impression that the temperature of the cup completely dominates the judgment. But in fact, if you think about it, there are thousands of things happening. I mean, the elevator, I thought the elevator was rather unpleasant. I mean, many things, the person who leads you, the person who asks you a question, the color of the wall. I mean, how do you know what will influence a person? And the temperature of the cup that you are holding is just one of hundreds of things that could influence your response. So if you think about it just objectively and neutrally, you would think this is unlikely, this one factor. This is the factor that they study in the laboratory, but it's unlikely to have a huge effect. And I think opinions are very sharply divided on this, and some people have lost friends on both sides because there's been a big debate. Some people claim that these effects are much exaggerated. That is, and you can see how that would happen. And it happens clearly when experimenters believe in something. There are ways in which they can make it happen, and there is no fraud involved. It's actually a very good example of doing things without knowing how you do them or why you do them. But I have become more skeptical of this line of research. There clearly is priming. There are priming effects. I believe that I promoted in my book, I won't talk about the study, but in my book, I cited research and I promoted research and I said, I believe it. And I said, you're not allowed not to believe it. So I said very extreme things about it. That was 10 years ago. And today I would say, go slow. in general, people are more reasonable, I would say, in terms of what influences them than this kind of study would lead you to believe, because it's actually, if you take this seriously, that the temperature of a cup will determine whether you get hired or you get fired. And this is said, listen to how it's described. It's not described that this is a 1% effect, increasing the probability that somebody will get fired or hired. In the film, it gets you fired and it gets you hired, depending on the temperature of the cup. Now, that's unreasonable. It's, it's implausible. And in fact, I think it's greatly exaggerated. That would be my opinion.
And it makes absolutely sense. I mean, what you're basically saying is take it with a grain of salt, and there may be something to it, but of course you can't be as black and white. Marcel, I know you have another question.
And one other one that's been very helpful to me. You wrote something in that book, but I hope you didn't discredit this, because I use it all the time. You wrote something that said, what I see is all there is. And I've used that with my clients over and over in coaching. I literally have them now put cards in front of themselves. I've had some amazing results from people, at least they reported it really helped them. Tell people, what do you mean when you say, what I see is all there is?
Well, it really means that the confidence that I have in an opinion and in my beliefs is really not influenced sufficiently by the quality of the evidence for it. But it's influenced by, what I can see and the proportion of what I can see that supports my beliefs. And because of confirmation bias, which was mentioned earlier, and that bias certainly exists, because of that, I tend to see the world as much simpler than it is. And I see what I see, but I give very little weight to what I don't see. So I have an example of what you see is all there is, which is my favorite example. And it's a puzzle. I can ask that of your audience, and I will say this. So Julie is a graduating senior at a university. And I will tell you one fact about Julie. She read fluently when she was 4 years old. What is her GPA? And everybody has a number. And I know what your number is, pretty much. It's around 3.7. And I know how you made up that number. But first of all, think. And that's an example of what you see is all there is. I gave you one fact about Julie, and it's a fact that happened when she was 4 years old. Now, in the meantime, so many things could have happened to Julie. And you treat that information as if it was sufficient to guess a grade. In fact, the correct answer is, what is the average grade at a university? 3.2. What is the quality of that information that I just got? It's really a very uninformative fact. Let's give her, my best guess is 3.3. That's not what people do. They treat it as if telling you the age at which she read is sufficient information. That's what I call whizzy-atty. What you see is all there is. You just don't think of what you don't know about Julie. Very good.
Absolutely amazing. Well, listen, I'm going to introduce our second guest, which is Nilüfer Merchant. And Nilüfer is an amazing individual. She's ranked as one of the top thinkers, business thinkers in the world by Thinkers 50. She is a former Apple executive. She's launched more than 100 different products, which have netted more than $18 billion in sales. And beside that, she's an amazing individual. Nilüfer, welcome to our show. You are super silent.
Right after we sat there and said, we got to turn on the unmute and mute button, there we did it. I just had to do it for everybody else who has this problem. I'm just showing what it looks like.
I just thought you hated me so much, so it's just silence, okay? I started to have a self-confidence issue here for 5 seconds, right? Just so you know. Listen, I'm so good to have you here. Listen, what I want to pick up on what Daniel was talking about, and that is the whole idea about confirmation bias, but it's also the idea about, for example, let's take the workplace. When people are onboarded into the workplace, depending on how we look like, how we behave, where we come from, the education, one can actually claim right now that we will put into a box, either in a tribe or not in a tribe, and that will impact our entire career. What's your view about that topic?
You know, I studied this a lot for the last few years, and can I tell you a story that kind of brings this to light? So there was a woman that I had studied who formed an organization called Black Girls Code. She had gone to Vanderbilt and was the first woman to go to college in her family, first generation, and had really worked her way pretty hard to get to her first degree. I think it was at Westinghouse. And her boss introduces her this way. Instead of saying, Kimberly's an engineer who has a passion in this, and here's why we brought her onto the team, like here's the skill set she's bringing or the passion she's bringing, she got introduced as, with Kimberly, we got a twofer, implying that her Blackness and her gender got them this opportunity, you know, this sort of like diversity checkbox moment. And it meant that she got seen by the surface of who she was and not who she actually, what she brought to the table. And we see this all the time. So I'm using a racial gendered version, but also you've probably heard it, millennials. Here's a millennial who's adding to the team. He's going to manage our social technology. And then that person gets viewed by their age and not actually like what's the set of history and things that this person brings to the table, this perspective that is so distinct to them. We see it also in the other ageism, right? Of Marshall would probably have a bunch of jokes about how we sometimes onboard people and we talk about their wisdom that they bring or their maturity that they bring. So whether it's race, sex, gender, ageism, it can also be our degrees. Like inside our organizations, we can say, well, that guy's worked in sales all our life, and it's a highly marketing-centric organization, which doesn't value sales, or vice versa, a team that values only product development and engineering and not sales and marketing. And so the way in which we sometimes talk about people is not based on here's why we bring them, here's the value we're hoping to get from them, but by this exterior view. And that's really missing out on the opportunity of saying, what is this person here to add value on? And then because then we're not honoring and seeing that person, we're seeing just the filtered version of that person. It changes how we then interpret and onboard that person in the team, right? Because then we say, oh, that person's this. I remember when I was early on in my career, I was an admin and I got invited to a meeting and got told I should participate fully in the meeting, even though I wasn't as senior as the other people. And I remember trying to, did the research because I am that person, showed up with questions because I am that person, and started to be like, I have thoughts and can I ask questions? And no one would even make eye contact with me. And I remember thinking, oh, I should have stayed in the parking lot, because in this meeting, what mattered was the MBAs who had gone to Berkeley. That's who kept getting called on. And I was like, oh, in this room, they're not actually seeing me and what I can bring, because they're first seeing I was the admin in the room. And so those are all the ways we can easily filter out ideas, filter out capabilities from the teams that we so need, novel perspectives on.
One thing that you've talked about that I found fascinating is the idea of covering up, and that 61% of the people you said give up on their ideas. And, in the book Noise, Daniel also talks about this in a different way, and for a variety of reasons. And again, you brought up some of these are reasonable reasons that they do give up. Tell me what you mean by covering up, and what would be your suggestion for corporations about this?
Yeah, so I'm actually, I found that research when I was writing The Power of Onlyness. And one of the assertions a lot of people have, and they say, if you want your idea to be heard, just speak up more. And this data, this research of 61% of us cover, helps us understand why that's not a good frame to hold that with. So the data is this. So 61% of us at work hide who we are. And it can be hiding our socioeconomic background. It can be hiding, our sexuality, if we think that group won't accept that. It can be hiding all sorts of different things. And the surprising part of the data to me was it wasn't the traditional groups that I would expect, the underseen, underrepresented groups. it was 45% of white men felt the need to cover too. And it was, in one example, a guy wearing glasses because he thought all the other thinkers in the room wore glasses. And so he started wearing glasses to hide. It would be like me looking at Daniel and Marshall and saying, and Brett in this case, and going, oh, I should wear glasses to this meeting. In fact, I should wear Daniel's because Daniel's a Nobel Prize winning economist. And it was that sort of level of covering that was happening in the room. And it means, of course, that we're not bringing our originality to the table. So we often talk about originality without addressing the social norms of what we're willing to do in that room to first fit in. So everyone knows Maslow's hierarchy, that in order to, like there's the food shelter part, then there's this big band of belonging before we can get to the highest level of ideas and contributions and the things that we care about. That belonging structure is what's happening at that 61%. We're looking at that room full of people and seeing maybe Hermes ties and saying, yeah, I'm not admitting that I did not grow up with wealth. And then we hide the thing that might help us say, hey, I want to change the banking industry because of the underbanked, right? Because then we're not going to say that because it shows or reveals too much in that room. And that's what's causing us to lose that innovation opportunity. That's the real cost.
It's really interesting. Now, Daniel, do you have any reflections of this? Because you work so much with different dimensions of this topic here.
Well, undoubtedly, when we are in a group, we are constantly influenced. I think it's probably more than 61%. I think it's all of us. To some extent, we're presenting an image of ourselves to others and it's not exactly who we are, because we're not the same person at home and at work anyway. And the person that we are at work is a construction, and that applies to everyone. Now, the people who are covering up something that they're ashamed of or embarrassed of, this is really paralyzing. This is really very damaging. I think that, wearing glasses because you think that will fit better is sort of ridiculous but harmless. But trying to prevent people from seeing things that are really you, that can be much more dangerous.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, listen, I just want to ask you, Neil, about onlyness, which is a word you have coined. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so this harmfulness of what we lose when people aren't able to show up as themselves. I wanted to think about what that was. And the words that we have in our current vocabulary before I came along and coined this word were things like unique. And unique implies a comparison. And sometimes it's so like, let's say I am the only woman in a boardroom. I am sometimes deemed unique. But it's because I'm being called that because of the context in which I exist. And I was trying to say, what is a way for us to center correctly on the value creation capacity that each of us has? So I came up with this word onlyness, that each of us stands in a spot in the world only one stands in. It is a function certainly of history and experience, but also a function of visions and hope. So I'm not just saying it's an archaeology dig of here's where you've come from and therefore who you are, but that spot you stand on has a perspective that only you have. And when we can add that to the room and center it correctly, then we can actually get access to all those novel ideas. So that's why I coined the word. It wasn't because I like marketing so much, but because we just have to find a way to center the source of value creation.
Beautiful. Okay, well, coming up, Daniel Kahneman argues that optimism is the most biased flaw we humans have. And I want to go back to that particular topic because what does it mean? Daniel, help me here to understand. What do you mean about optimism? It's a flaw.
Well, optimism is not only a flaw, it's also wonderful. I also called optimism the engine of capitalism. The point, I think, about optimism is that most of us, most of the time, are too optimistic about our actions and about the outcomes of our actions. This, I think, there's a lot of evidence for. Now, it's also a fact that when you look back at the most successful people, they were tremendously optimistic. And you could say that actually they overestimated their odds of success. And it's because they overestimated the odds of success that they tried things that other people would not have tried. And so most of the people who are successful are great optimists. That doesn't mean that all optimists are successful. And in that sense, we got to be careful. To be optimist is a wonderful thing. To be optimist, for one thing, makes you happy. It makes other people happy. It makes you more popular. It's a very, very good thing to be an optimist. I am a pessimist, so I know that it's not so wonderful to be a pessimist. Being an optimist is better. But being an optimist really means that sometimes when you take risks, it's not because you want to take them. It's because you don't know they're there. And that's a different story.
Marshall?
Yeah, I think there's a book called The Secret, which kind of illustrates the point that they did this, they are successful, therefore if you do this, you will be successful. There's a thing called the survivor bias. And they only interview the winners, and yeah, the winners believe they would win. That's nice. Every waitress in Hollywood had big, hairy, audacious goals, and there's still waitresses in Hollywood. So, back to that point, there's nothing wrong with optimism, but we make this knee-jerk reaction. If you do this, you'll be a success. That ignores the survivor bias.
Absolutely.
Right, it would be like saying Anne Frank didn't think well enough of herself or something, right? And that's not the issue.
Yeah, good.
Absolutely. Now, listen, I'm so curious about both of you. And I would like to ask both of you if you should give yourself, the younger self, an advice from the knowledge, or based on the knowledge you have right now, what advice would you give the younger self? Start off with you, Daniel, and go to you, Nilfer.
All my life I've lived pretty much without a plan. I've been very lucky and doing things that interested me and working with friends that I liked. So I would not advise myself to change things. I wasted a lot of time and a lot of effort, but much of the time wasted was actually fun. So when I look back at my life, I'm not sorry. So I wouldn't give, but I should add that I rarely give advice. I think giving advice, you have to be careful about.
Yeah, exactly. In particular in the academic world, right? It's much easier in the other type of world, right? Nilfer, what's your view on it?
This morning we were talking about this conversation is about how to make better decisions. And I was thinking about just moments in my career where I thought one thing, and then it took me X period of longer time to understand the way I was even conceiving of it stopped me from making a good decision. So can I share one story then? I hope we have time. Yeah, so one of my early points in my career, I was running a server product line thing in Apple. It was the only profitable part of the business. And we were sort of asked to drive growth, but on as little dollars as possible, because of course the whole company was tanking. Like at the time, it was before Steve Jobs came back. And my boss had said to me, the one with the pain is the one with the problem. And so every time there was a resource issue or a competition issue between who would do what, he would say to me, the one with the pain is the one with the problem. And I would be like, well, then I don't want to be the one with the pain. I would just try to figure out how to pin it on someone else. And I really struggled with that euphemism, because sometimes I thought it was self-hatred then driven, like, oh, I must suck at this thing. Sometimes then I wanted to blame someone else, like, oh, he's not doing what he should be doing. And really the larger frame, what I just walked through, right? Is it me, or is it him or them, or is it it? And when I understood that actually, 10, 15, some period of time later, how much the organization was being starved of resources to effectively do what it needed to do, the problem was much more ours than it was personal. And yet, how often did I accept that euphemism and therefore try to make decisions where it was a tug of war. And my goal was to try to pull harder on my side of the rope. And instead, I could have gotten the team much more focused on the larger organizational conflict. That was really what needed to get resolved. What's the organizational conflict here where we say this is the one thing that's driving growth, but we're under-resourcing it to all hell? Then we could actually have a different conversation as a leadership team. And that piece, I wish I understood better how it's 9 times out of 10, we're stuck in constructs that limit us from actually making better decisions.
You know, Martin, I want to be time sensitive because we made a commitment here. So I think we need to start wrapping it up. So I'll just carry it over to you.
Absolutely. And I was just about to say the same to you. I want to say thank you to both of you. It's been absolutely amazing to have you on this show. What an amazing perspective. Listen, Marshall, what's your reflections now?
My reflection is to back away and admit you're human and admit you're subject to all kinds of things, and admit maybe sometimes we don't know. We don't know why we're doing what we're doing. Just being open to that, I think, makes a huge difference. And being willing to look at that noise audit thing, just look at some reality and say, maybe there's a chance, that I can learn something here.
Well said. Well, listen, thanks to everyone. I'm going to just do the mural summary, just to summarize what we learned so far. How can one possibly summarize what a Nobel Prize winning individual have come up with all this brilliance throughout his entire career, and also what a former Apple executive have learned through so many years? Well, I'm setting myself up completely for failure right now, but I'm going to give it a go anyway. So first of all, what Daniel Kahneman was talking about was the idea of noise. The whole idea that we are so focused on what we actually see and what we hear, but it's actually not that we should be focused on. We should be focused on the things we don't see, the things we don't hear, because that quite often shapes the reality much more than what's just in front of us. And that actually leads me back to a second point, which is leading out of his work. Now, one of my personal theories really may be helpful here. I always said that when it comes to our conscious mind, it's almost like an iceberg. Imagine we put some water on the screen now, and then I have an iceberg. And the iceberg have what's above the surface and what's below the surface. Now, what's above the surface, you could say that is the conscious mind, and what's below is the non-conscious mind. And this is where Daniel Kahneman worked with a theory called System 1 and System 2. A system, basically the first system, System 2, is all about the conscious part. It's where we have to be slow when we're thinking. We have to think about the more complex things. We have to be aware of that. That's really important. And that's one of his key theories. But if I go under the surface, that's what he called System 1. That is where we are emotional. That's where we are quick. That's where we are instinctive. It's all these things. That's, by the way, also where instinctive behavior is coming from, which is one of the questions which Marshall asked about. This is the dangerous place, because this is, you could say, an accumulation of experiences through many years of our life. We may be able to connect the dots. We just don't know why. And the big question is, of course, when should we trust our instinct or not? What Daniel was saying here, and he agrees with what Nelfer is also saying, is that when we go into a room, most of us are playing a game here. She called it covering. The whole idea about that we actually put on glasses, we sit in a certain way so we fit into a tribe. Now, Nelfer was talking about that 61% of us actually is part of this act. So the signals we're sending to the world kind of are completely derailing us. And what Daniel Kahneman is saying is, Nelfer, you're not right. It's not 61%. It's even more. And that gives you a sense of why we right now are hitting this huge issue when it comes to equality and all that movement we're seeing happening now, because the signals we send is actually happening in what he calls System 1. And we don't even really know what's going on down there. I don't know if this is a conclusion or not, but certainly it's very thought-provoking. I guess that's the summary. That's the mural summary. Wow, what an amazing insight we've learned today. Thanks to both of our unbelievable guests. Now, Marshall, I had to tell you just before we wrap up for the holidays, we have some pretty spectacular guests coming up next time. And next time, it is, first of all, Celeste Headley. Celeste has anchored shows including Tell Me More, Talk of the Nation, All Things Considered, and the Weekend Edition for NPR. She is the author of We Need to Talk More, and her TED Talk actually was watched by more than 15 million people. Celeste will be joined by John Dickerson. He's a CBS News and senior national correspondent for CBS Sunday Morning. And he also has received a ton of different awards, and that is happening on the 15th of December at 2 p.m. East. So I can only say, I hope you'll join both Marshall and I, the 15th of December. We're going to have another round of fun and hopefully a little bit of inspiration. Thanks and bye for now.
Persuade, listen, dialogue, inspire, motivate, and all of those are emotional intelligence skills. It's a completely independent factor in success, and it has to do with whether you can keep your eye on the goal.